Uist is gearing up to vote for our next MP on July 4th. Anne Pàipear sat down to speak to the candidates and find out how they'll work for Uist.
I'm Susan Thomson. I'm the SNP candidate for this constituency in the upcoming general election. The three things that are affecting us all come from lack of funding. And that funding ultimately comes from Westminster. And that's why it's really important that we fight this general election, although we know going into the general election that the SNP are never going to be in power in Westminster. It's really important that we are there in Westminster to be a strong, united voice for the people of these islands. But when it comes to funding, we are consistently underfunded, and decisions that are made in Westminster, and often made in Westminster unchallenged, because the two main parties at Westminster are so similar on so many issues, and the health service is one of them. They want to see more privatisation in the health service in England. And where it starts to get a bit complicated and sometimes a bit boring for people is, how does that affect Scotland? And it affects Scotland because the money that is spent on health in England directly relates to the money that is available to spend on health in Scotland. There's less public money being spent down south, which means there's less public money available for the NHS in Scotland. And that's how it works. You know, it's constantly in the back of your mind if anything happens to the kids, or yourself, or your partner, or whoever, where are we going to go for our treatment? So it's not something that's abstract for me. It's how, you know, it's how I live my life. I think that lived experience is really important, and I think that's why representation is so important, because it's the different perspectives. You know, we don't want everyone looking the same, having the same lived experience, because you're not going to get any depth to that policy making. It needs to be grounded in lived experience. The lived experience of someone in Uist with regards to health is very different, as you were saying, to the lived experience of somebody in Stornoway with regards to health. And I think it really is time that we spoke seriously about connectivity. You know, my own feeling is that ferries are great, but they're a 20th century solution, and maybe we need to talk seriously and honestly about what's next. You know, yes, it'll be expensive if we're talking about tunnels, and some people are very much against them, and I understand that, but we have to have a conversation about, so that we're all talking about the same thing. You know, some people propose just joining up over the Sounds. Some people talk about a link to the mainland, and I think until we're really, really clear about what we're talking about, we can't have that proper conversation so that we all understand what the issues are. I'm pressing really hard with the council to start that conversation. No, don't worry about the money right now, let's just get the proposal. This is the first time that we will have to take photographic ID to the polling stations. Excuse me, and particularly for young people. I don't want their first experience of voting in a general election to be a negative one where they don't get a chance to vote. So you must take photographic ID with you to the polling station if you are voting in person. If you've got a postal vote, that doesn't matter, but it must be the actual document itself and not something in your Apple Wallet. It must be the real hard copy of your driver's licence or your passport or something along those lines, so that you can all the information.
I think that's probably going to affect people who've also been voting for the last 50 years and they've never had to do this before. And that's going to be maybe a bit of a shock to people. So I think it's really important.
Really important. But if you're a postal vote, you're fine. All the information's on the UK government's website and on the Corla's website about what information, what you need, what ID is acceptable. Child poverty is one of these things that has, for the Scottish government anyway, has been front and centre. You know, you take a step back from that and you think, we live in a wealthy Western country and we see food banks. We see food banks here, and if you're on the East Coast, you see oil rigs out there. So it's, you know, that's the climate we're working in. So lots of money is spent on mitigating poverty. And these policies like the Scottish Child Payment, which we know is hugely successful, has lifted 100,000 children out of poverty in Scotland. It means that these children, the families of these children get £26 every week. And that's because there's a structural issue that makes working, these are people who are mostly in work poverty. There's a situation that is allowed to exist whereby employers are allowed to pay people a wage that does not allow them to feed their families. So that's what I mean about structural issues, and we're dealing with that. So we mitigate these problems and we spend on social security For things like the Scottish Child Payment and the Adult Disability Payment, we spend £500 million a year. So what could we do with that money if we weren't mitigating policies that we've got no control over making? What sort of positive things could we do if we weren't having to mitigate the bedroom tax and the 2-child cap on benefits and the rape clause and things like that? How transformational could that be if we were an independent country and making those decisions? You know, we learned very quickly during the pandemic that just because you're not paid a lot of money doesn't mean that your job isn't massively important. But that doesn't really seem to have translated after the pandemic. I think we've come to a time where we need to seriously look at the situation in Westminster and really consider whether we think that the Westminster government, regardless of which political party it is, if the actual establishment in Westminster is capable of the kind of change that we need for us to move forward to be the kind of country that we want to live in, and if it's maybe time to look at our ambitions and look at the ambitions that people south of the border vote for and maybe say it's time that we went our separate ways, shake hands and carry on as friends and good neighbours, but perhaps have our own governments like any normal independent country.